My name is Michael Hayes, and in the spring of 1975, I was a 26-year-old Vietnam veteran working as a mechanic in my hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa, when I fell in love with a woman who would change everything I thought I knew about war, healing, and what it meant to belong somewhere. Her name was Linh Nguyen, and she was one of the Vietnamese refugees who had been resettled in our small farming community as part of the massive evacuation that followed the fall of Saigon. What I didn't anticipate was that loving someone who represented everything my neighbors wanted to forget about Vietnam would turn my own community against me, forcing me to choose between the woman who had saved my soul and the hometown that had raised me but could no longer accept who I had become. I had returned from Vietnam in 1973, carrying wounds that weren't visible but were slowly destroying my ability to function in civilian life. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to connect with people who had never experienced combat, what we now call PTSD, but then was just considered part of being a veteran who needed to get over it and move on with his life. I worked long hours at Henderson's Auto Repair, where the familiar routine of fixing engines provided some stability, but my evenings and weekends were marked by drinking, isolation, and a growing sense that I would never be able to bridge the gap between my war experiences and the peaceful small-town life that everyone expected me to resume. Cedar Falls was the kind of community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where families had lived for generations, and where the Vietnam War was something that happened far away to other people's sons, except when those sons came home different than they had left. The town's response to returning veterans was complicated, mixing genuine appreciation for our service with discomfort about the unpopular war we had fought and the changes it had made in young men they had known since childhood. "Michael, you just need to put all that behind you and focus on building a future here," my mother would say whenever my struggles with readjustment became obvious to family members who loved me but couldn't understand what I was going through. "The war is over now, and there's no point in dwelling on things you can't change. Find a nice local girl, settle down, and start the family your father and I have been hoping for." The irony was that Cedar Falls had been selected as one of the resettlement locations for Vietnamese refugees, precisely because it was the kind of stable, wholesome American community that government officials believed would provide the best environment for people who had lost everything and needed to start over in a completely foreign culture. The town's Protestant work ethic, agricultural economy, and reputation for neighborly helpfulness made it seem like an ideal place to demonstrate American generosity toward allies who had supported us during the war. But the reality of having actual Vietnamese people living in Cedar Falls proved more challenging than the abstract idea of helping refugees had suggested. The 53 Vietnamese refugees who arrived in April 1975 represented not just a humanitarian gesture, but a daily reminder of America's first military defeat and the controversial war that had divided the country for over a decade. Their presence forced residents to confront their own conflicted feelings about Vietnam, while trying to figure out how to integrate people whose language, culture, and experiences were completely foreign to everything they knew about community life. I first encountered Linh at the local grocery store, where she was trying to communicate with the clerk about items she needed but couldn't identify in English. Her frustration was obvious, and the clerk's impatience was making the situation worse for both of them. Something about her dignity in the face of that small daily humiliation reminded me of the Vietnamese civilians I had encountered during the war, people who had maintained their grace and humanity despite living through circumstances that would have broken most of us. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her with the few Vietnamese phrases I had picked up during my tour of duty. "Toi ko the Gup Kong." "Can I help?" The look of relief and surprise that crossed her face when she heard someone speak her language, however badly, was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. For the first time since returning from Vietnam, I felt like my war experience might be useful for something other than nightmares and flashbacks. The conversation that followed was conducted in broken English, supplemented by my limited Vietnamese and a lot of gestures and pointing, but it was the most meaningful communication I had experienced since coming home from Southeast Asia. Linh was trying to find ingredients to prepare traditional Vietnamese food for her family, but American grocery stores didn't carry the vegetables, spices, and other items that were essential to the cuisine she knew how to cook. "You speak Vietnamese," she said in careful English, studying my face with curiosity and something that might have been recognition. "You were soldier in my country?" When I nodded, she continued, "Most American soldiers, they leave Vietnam and try to forget." Why you still remember language? Her question cut straight to the heart of my struggle with readjustment. The feeling that forgetting Vietnam would mean abandoning not just painful memories, but also experiences that had fundamentally changed who I was and how I understood the world. I can't forget, I told her honestly. Vietnam is part of me now. The language, the people, the experience, it's all part of who I've become. Over the following weeks, I began volunteering to help Vietnamese refugee families navigate the practical challenges of life in Iowa, translating at medical appointments, explaining American banking systems, helping children register for school. The work gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing since my discharge from the Army, while also providing opportunities to spend time with Lynn and her extended family, who had been placed together in a duplex on the outskirts of town. Lynn's story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had been a teacher in Saigon before the war disrupted her life, forcing her to flee with her elderly parents and younger brother when the city fell to North Vietnamese forces. Everything she had known, her career, her home, her culture, her language, had been left behind in the desperate escape that brought her to the refugee camps and eventually to Iowa. But instead of being crushed by these losses, she was working to rebuild her life while helping other refugee families adapt to their new circumstances. In Vietnam, I teach children to read and write, she told me during one of our conversations about her background and her hopes for the future. Here, I must learn to read and write myself like child again. Very difficult, but not impossible. American dream, yes? You start over, work hard, build new life better than old life. Before you continue this powerful story of love across cultural boundaries and community resistance with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales about the couples who chose love over prejudice and found ways to bridge the divides that war and fear create between people. The attraction that developed between Lynn and me was gradual but unmistakable, built on shared understanding of loss, displacement, and the challenge of finding meaning after experiencing trauma that had changed us both. My war experiences had made me an outsider in my own community, while her refugee status made her an outsider in American society. Together, we found a connection that helped both of us feel less alone with our struggles to belong somewhere. The first time I asked Lynn to have dinner with me outside the context of helping with refugee services, her response revealed both her interest and her awareness of the social complications our relationship would create. "Michael, you are a kind man and good friend to Vietnamese families," she said carefully. "But if we become more than friends, people in your town will not understand. They see me as enemy person from war they want to forget. They see you as American man who should marry American woman." Her concerns were entirely justified, as I was beginning to discover through comments from co-workers, neighbors, and even family members who had noticed my involvement with the refugee community and were starting to question my motivations and my loyalty to American values. "Michael, it's nice that you're helping those people," my supervisor at the garage told me, "but you need to be careful about getting too involved with them. They're here temporarily until they can figure out how to go back where they came from. Don't get so attached that you forget you're an American living in America." The deepening of my relationship with Lynn throughout the summer and fall of 1975 coincided with growing tensions in Cedar Falls over the presence of Vietnamese refugees and their impact on the community's sense of identity and social cohesion. What had initially been presented as a temporary humanitarian gesture was becoming a permanent demographic change that forced residents to confront their assumptions about American identity, cultural assimilation, and what it meant to belong in a small Midwestern town. The resistance to the refugee resettlement program took various forms, from passive exclusion to active hostility. Vietnamese families found it difficult to find employment beyond menial labor. Their children faced harassment at school, and social services were provided grudgingly rather than with the welcoming spirit that had supposedly motivated the decision to accept refugees in the first place. "They're taking jobs from American workers," became a common complaint, despite the fact that most refugees were working in positions that local residents had been unwilling to fill. My public relationship with Lynn began to attract negative attention that went far beyond curiosity or disapproval of interracial dating. Because she was Vietnamese, our relationship was seen as a betrayal not just of racial boundaries, but of national loyalty, as if loving someone from Vietnam meant I was somehow supporting America's enemies in the war that had just ended with our defeat and withdrawal. "Hayes, what the hell is wrong with you?" confronted Bob Patterson, a fellow veteran who had served in Vietnam a year before me. "We spent blood and treasure fighting those people, and now you're dating one of them? That's like spitting on every American who died over there. Have you completely lost your mind?" The accusation that my relationship with Lynn dishonored fallen American soldiers was particularly painful because it came from someone who had shared similar combat experiences and should have understood the complexity of our feelings about Vietnam and its people. But Bob's reaction revealed how many veterans were processing their war experiences by maintaining clear distinctions between us and them, American and Vietnamese, friend and enemy. Distinctions that my relationship with Lynn was making uncomfortably complicated. The economic pressure began when several customers at Henderson's Auto Repair made it clear that they would take their business elsewhere if the shop continued to employ someone who was fraternizing with the enemy. My boss, Jim Henderson, was a decent man who had supported my employment despite my occasional struggles with PTSD symptoms, but he was also a businessman who couldn't afford to lose customers over political controversies. "Michael, I don't have anything personal against you or your girlfriend," Henderson told me during a difficult conversation about my future at the shop. "But I'm getting pressure from customers who say they won't do business with us if we keep someone on the payroll who's involved with the Vietnamese. I need you to understand that this isn't about my personal feelings. It's about keeping the business afloat during tough economic times." The social isolation that followed was comprehensive and crushing. Friends who had known me since childhood began avoiding me. Family members expressed their disappointment in increasingly harsh terms, and even casual acquaintances felt free to comment on my relationship choices and their implications for my standing in the community. "You used to be a good American boy," one neighbor told me, "but now you're acting like you've forgotten which side you were on in the war." Lynn's response to the hostility we faced revealed both her strength and her understanding of the complex dynamics that surrounded our relationship. She had experienced enough prejudice and discrimination during her time in America to recognize that our relationship was making both of us targets, but she also understood that backing down from bigotry would only validate the attitudes that were making life difficult for all Vietnamese refugees in Cedar Falls. "Michael, I know this is very hard for you," she said during one of our conversations about the pressure we were facing. "Your family, your friends, your work, everything you know here become problem because you love me. Maybe you think easier if you find American girlfriend and I find Vietnamese husband. Make everyone happy except us." Her willingness to sacrifice our relationship for my social and economic well-being only strengthened my determination to fight for our love and for the principle that people should be judged by their character rather than their nationality or the circumstances that had brought them to America. "Lynn, I didn't survive Vietnam just to come home and live according to other people's prejudices," I told her. "I love you, and I'm not going to let fear or hatred stop us from building a life together." The turning point in our struggle against community opposition came when Lynn's younger brother, Duke, was attacked by a group of high school students who had been encouraged by their parents' anti-Vietnamese sentiment to view refugee children as legitimate targets for harassment and violence. The 16-year-old boy was hospitalized with a concussion and broken ribs after being beaten by students who called him Gook and told him to go back where you came from. The incident forced Cedar Falls to confront the real-world consequences of the rhetoric and attitudes that had been building against the Vietnamese refugee community. While most residents were genuinely horrified by the violence against a teenager, the attack also revealed how much anti-Vietnamese sentiment had been normalized and encouraged through supposedly respectable channels like newspaper editorials, town meetings, and casual conversation that treated refugees as invaders rather than allies who had supported American forces during the war. My response to the attack on Duke was to organize a meeting of Vietnam veterans to discuss our responsibility toward the Vietnamese refugees who had been resettled in our community. "These people aren't our enemies," I told the assembled group of former soldiers. "They're our allies who fought alongside us and who were evacuated because they had supported American forces and would have been killed if they had stayed in Vietnam. When we tolerate attacks on Vietnamese refugees, we're betraying people who risked their lives to help us." The veterans' meeting produced mixed results, with some former soldiers agreeing that we had an obligation to protect Vietnamese allies, while others maintained that all Vietnamese people were essentially enemies regardless of which side they had supported during the war. But the fact that Vietnam veterans were publicly debating our responsibilities toward refugees helped shift the community conversation away from simple anti-foreign sentiment toward more complex questions about loyalty, honor, and what America owed to people who had sacrificed for our cause. The support that began to emerge from unexpected sources included some community leaders who recognized that the treatment of Vietnamese refugees reflected badly on Cedar Falls' reputation and values. Pastor Robert Williams of First Methodist Church began preaching sermons about Christian obligations to welcome strangers and care for those who had lost everything, while Dr. Margaret Thompson started a free medical clinic specifically designed to serve refugee families who were having difficulty accessing health care. The way we treat these Vietnamese families will be remembered long after the emotions of the war have faded, Pastor Williams told his congregation during one particularly powerful sermon. Are we going to be remembered as a community that welcomed allies in their time of need, or as people who turned our backs on those who had supported us when they needed our help the most? The gradual shift in community attitudes was slow and incomplete, but it created space for Lynn and me to build support for our relationship among people who were willing to judge us as individuals rather than as symbols of controversial political and cultural issues. The English classes that Lynn began teaching to help other refugees improve their language skills demonstrated her value to the community, while my work translating for Vietnamese families at medical appointments and government offices showed that my relationship with her was part of a broader commitment to helping people who were struggling to adapt to American life. The winter of 1975-76 marked a crucial period in both our relationship and the broader community's adjustment to the reality of Vietnamese refugees as permanent neighbors rather than temporary guests. The initial crisis atmosphere that had surrounded their arrival was giving way to more practical questions about integration, employment, education, and the long-term implications of cultural diversity in a community that had been overwhelmingly white and Protestant for generations. Lynn's success in learning English and finding work as a teacher's aide at the elementary school helped demonstrate that Vietnamese refugees could contribute positively to Cedar Falls rather than simply consuming services and creating problems. Her gentle demeanor and obvious intelligence gradually won over people who had been predisposed to view all Vietnamese people with suspicion, while her dedication to helping refugee children succeed in American schools showed that she shared the community's values about education and hard work. Mrs. Nguyen has been wonderful with the children, reported Principal Johnson during a school board meeting that I attended to show support for Lynn's employment. She brings a unique perspective to our staff, and her bilingual abilities have been invaluable in helping Vietnamese students adapt to American classroom expectations. We're fortunate to have someone with her skills and dedication working with our children. The official recognition of Lynn's contributions to the community provided validation that our relationship was not just about personal attraction, but about building bridges between different cultural groups that were now part of Cedar Falls' permanent population. My own reputation began to recover as people saw that my involvement with the Vietnamese community was producing positive results rather than just creating controversy and division. The proposal came during a quiet moment in early spring 1976, as we sat together watching the sunset from the hill overlooking the small farm that Lynn's extended family had begun working with assistance from the County Agricultural Extension Office. "Lynn, I want to build a life with you," I said, offering her the engagement ring that had belonged to my grandmother. "I know it won't be easy, and I know we'll face challenges that other couples don't have to deal with. But I love you, and I can't imagine a future without you in it." Her acceptance was immediate and joyful, but it was also accompanied by practical concerns about the implications of marriage for both of our futures. "Michael, if we marry, I become American citizen, but you become husband of Vietnamese woman forever. Some people in this town, they never accept that. Are you ready for a lifetime of being different, being outsider sometimes in your own home community?" The engagement announcement that appeared in the Cedar Falls Gazette was met with a mixture of congratulations and criticism that reflected the community's continued ambivalence about interracial and intercultural relationships. While some residents expressed support for our decision to marry, others saw it as confirmation that I had been permanently corrupted by my war experiences and my association with foreign influences. The wedding planning process became an education in cultural compromise and community diplomacy as we worked to create a ceremony that honored both of our backgrounds while building support for our marriage among people who remained skeptical about the wisdom of our relationship. Pastor Williams agreed to perform the ceremony at First Methodist Church, while Lynn's family prepared traditional Vietnamese foods for the reception that would follow at the American Legion Hall. I want our wedding to show people that Vietnamese and American cultures can complement each other rather than competing, Lynn explained as we planned the details of our ceremony. Your traditions and my traditions, they both have beauty and meaning. Together, maybe they create something new that belongs to both of us and to our children who will grow up in America but also know where their mother came from. The wedding ceremony itself, held on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in June 1976, became a community event that drew people who wanted to witness history being made, as well as those who simply wanted to celebrate love overcoming obstacles. The sight of Lynn in her beautiful Audai traditional dress, walking down the aisle of a Methodist church to marry an American veteran, created a powerful symbol of reconciliation and hope that moved even some of our former critics. The reception featured both American wedding traditions and Vietnamese customs that many guests were experiencing for the first time. The opportunity to taste authentic Vietnamese food, hear traditional music, and learn about cultural practices that were new to most residents of Cedar Falls helped humanize the refugee community and demonstrate that cultural differences could enrich rather than threaten American traditions. "This is the most beautiful wedding I've ever attended," commented Mrs. Anderson, an elderly neighbor who had initially been critical of Vietnamese refugees, but had gradually changed her mind through personal interactions with families in the community. "Seeing how happy they are together makes me realize that love really can bridge any gap, even the gaps created by war and cultural differences." The years that followed our marriage were marked by gradual acceptance and integration, as Lynn and I built a life together that demonstrated the possibility of successful cross-cultural relationships while contributing to the broader process of community healing and growth. Lynn's work in the school system expanded to include ESL instruction for immigrant students from various backgrounds, while I eventually opened my own auto repair shop that served both Vietnamese and American customers. The children we raised together, 2 daughters who inherited their mother's intelligence and grace, along with their father's determination and mechanical aptitude, grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Vietnamese traditions and American customs. Their success in school and their integration into community activities helped demonstrate that the children of refugees could become fully American while maintaining connections to their parents' heritage. "Our daughters represent the future of America," Lynn often said as we watched them participate in school plays, sports teams, and community service projects. "They show that being American doesn't mean forgetting where your family came from, and that loving your heritage doesn't mean you can't also love your country." The broader impact of our marriage extended beyond our personal happiness to influence how Cedar Falls approached subsequent waves of refugees and immigrants from various countries. The lessons learned from the Vietnamese resettlement program, both the mistakes and the successes, helped the community develop better policies and attitudes for welcoming newcomers while maintaining social cohesion. Looking back on those challenging years in the mid-1970s, I understand that falling in love with Lynn was not just about personal attraction, but about healing from the trauma of war through connection with someone who had experienced similar losses and displacement. Our relationship became a bridge between the Vietnam that had wounded both of us and the America where we could build something new together. The town that initially turned against us for loving across cultural boundaries eventually became a place where our marriage was celebrated as an example of America's capacity for growth, healing, and inclusion. The prejudice and hostility we faced were real and painful, but they were ultimately overcome by the persistent demonstration that love, respect, and shared values could transcend the divisions created by war and fear. My love for a Vietnamese refugee in 1975 taught me that home is not just the place where you were born, but the place where you choose to build a life with the people you love. Cedar Falls became home for both of us, not because it was always welcoming, but because we made it welcoming through our commitment to each other and to the community that eventually embraced us. The story of our relationship became part of the larger narrative of how small American communities learned to adapt to the demographic and cultural changes that followed the end of the Vietnam War. Our marriage proved that the supposed enemies from that conflict could become beloved family members, trusted neighbors, and valued contributors to the American communities that gave them the chance to rebuild their lives in freedom.